Hello friends, I'm currently visiting my family who live in the north of England. I have a 2-week vacation and I brought with me some books to read. In fact, there are 6 or 7 books here on the table, and some of my relatives started asking me why the hell I need 6 or 7 books for just a 2-week period. I had to reply to them and say that, you know what, I'm a parallel reader. I read multiple books at once. And in fact, I explored this concept, this approach of mine to reading in one of my videos where I told you all about how I read multiple books at a time. So I'm not going to delve deep into everything that I explored in that video. You can find it in fact in one of the corners and in the description. In this video, I would like to talk about the books that are on my focus right now. Let's jump and talk about those books briefly. I will just show them to you. The first one is Bookseller's Tale by Martin Latham. Very interesting, very entertaining. The second book is Horace, who was a poet and philosopher of ancient Rome. I'm currently reading his Epistles. Another book that is more fictional, it's not philosophical, it's a book written by W.G.Sebald. It's called Austerlitz, a wonderful piece of literature. I cannot wait to tell you about it in depth. The fourth book on this list is Judith Schalansky's book called An Inventory of Losses, which explores different objects that our civilization, that humanity has lost, and kind of magical and mystical elements of those objects and subjects. The final 2 books on this list is biography of Frederick the Great, who was one of the greatest conquerors in history. He was also a philosopher king. It's a biography written by Blanning, who is a wonderful writer. And the final book is a book that I constantly tell you about on this channel ever since I read it. It's a book that I've just finished reading a couple of months ago, and it's still with me. I cannot put this book back on the shelf because I want to absorb every sentence that I've highlighted in it in full. So it's a book written by Marguerite, Yourcenar. It's called Memoirs of Hadrian. So let's talk about these books in more detail. The first one is Bookseller's Tale by Martin Latham, and Martin Latham was the manager of Waterstone's bookstore in Canterbury for 35 years. Bookshops are our modern secular churches where we can come and find shelter and spiritual comfort. Bookshops are full of magical power, and Martin Latham, as a bookseller for 35 years, knows this. So this book is full of bookish stories about ancient libraries, book hunters who traveled across Europe in search of lost manuscripts, and generally about booksellers and private collectors. There is one idea about bookshops and how we experience bookshops that I keep thinking about, and I would like to explore in this video. And this idea is about magical power that bookstores have. Martin Latham tells us that the bookstore has an ability to open up islands of knowledge that you have never thought existed. It's the best place to explore books, to discover things that you don't know, that to test and to know how ignorant you are about the world. It's a place which cannot be replaced by algorithm. I really enjoyed reading this book, but there is a small criticism of it. There are a lot of inspiring stories in it. Stories of great book collectors, the stories about great books in general. But sometimes this book feels like you are watching TikTok, because sometimes you read one great story, then you read another one in the next 3 pages, then it switches to another great story, and there is so much information, inspiring and interesting information that you sometimes need that break. I think just the fact that I'm a parallel reader, that I have other books to switch to in order to give this book a rest before I continue reading it, helped me a lot. It's a book that is better to read in parts, to take a pause, and I think parallel reading is very helpful in this case. Let's jump to the second book, which is Horace's Epistles. I'd like to share with you a couple of wise quotes from Horace that I added to my own commonplace journal. The first one says that who has begun has half done. Have the courage to be wise. Begin. The next quote is very much connected to the previous one, where Horace says that he who feared that he would not succeed, sat still. It is unbelievable how much wisdom one can condense in a just single sentence, in just 7 words. Horace was a philosopher and a poet. He was a contemporary of Virgil, who wrote Aeneid. But what makes Horace interesting is that he wrote those epistles, which are essentially philosophical letters written in beautiful poetical form. It was Horace who inspired Stoic philosophers such as Epictetus, Seneca, and in case of Seneca, you sometimes see how Seneca borrowed some of Horace's ideas. Everyone who is familiar with Seneca will notice a lot of similarities. I would recommend you to buy Oxford World Classics edition and not Everyman Library edition, because Everyman Library edition is selected works by Horace, and they omit a lot of great epistles which are included here. So if you are going to buy this book, which will be linked in the description, please go for this edition, not for the Everyman one. The next book is of a different genre. It's a book written by W.G.Sebald, who is arguably one of the greatest modern writers. This book is about a character whose name is Jacques Austerlitz. In our day and age, when we are told that our identity is flexible, that it fluctuates, that we can be whoever we want to be, W.G.Sebald shows us that there is a core element in us that cannot be erased either by external circumstances or by our internal conscious self. Because this is a story of Jacques Austerlitz, a man who was sent away from home to live with foster parents, and his foster parents tried to erase all of his identity before Jacques Austerlitz arrived to live with him when he was 4 years old. One of the themes of this story is the battle inside of Jacques between desire to know where he comes from, but the fear of knowing where he comes from, because he doesn't know who he exactly is. He doesn't want to erase his identity that were given to him by foster parents, but at the same time he wants to actually know where he comes from. He knows that there is a core identity in him that is hidden, that he hasn't been told about, but what kind of can of worms this journey will bring him up to really scares him. I really enjoyed this story, and I think W.G.Sebald is a genius. This is my first book written by W.G.Sebald. So many people recommended me to read his writings, and I finally got my hands to it. If you are into writers such as Hermann Hesse, such as Hermann Broch, such as Yourcenar, he's just a very good writer. It was a great recommendation. In contrast to Judith Schalansky, who wrote an inventory of losses. Unfortunately, this book had so much promise in it, so much interesting kind of approach to a subject, but it didn't satisfy what I expected through it. It's a book that I thought would be great, but it turned out to be badly executed. Schalansky selects 12 objects and subjects that have been lost by our civilization. Islands that sunk under the sea and no longer exist, or manuscripts that have been lost, animals that were killed and will never be born again. You can imagine how interesting is this subject. The way she writes about them is not engaging at all. She tries to be sublime, but she comes out as shallow. It is a very cruel review, I know, but this is how I feel about it. I really struggle reading it. I think the topics and objects and subjects were selected perfectly. It's unfortunately so badly written. There are so many unnecessary descriptions, sentences, and ideas that lead nowhere. Maybe I'll read some other books on this list and I'll come back to it and change my opinion, but I have to say, not so impressed by this book, unfortunately. Last 2 books are focused on a single personality, and the first one is Frederick the Great, one of the greatest conquerors in history. He was also a philosopher king, and the biography written by Tim Blanning shows how difficult was it for Frederick to become who he is. He became this great king despite of the things that he experienced in his life, especially in his youth, because his father was this brutal military commander, dictator who humiliated his son in every occasion that he could. His father hated the fact that Frederick was interested in arts and philosophy. He destroyed Frederick's library that he assembled in secret. He killed his friend, executed his friend in front of his eyes, because this friend of Frederick tried to help him to escape from the tyrannical rule of his father, but was caught. He had a very terrible youth and childhood, but once his father died and he became the king, he proved to his father that in order to be a great soldier, in order to be a great man, in order to be a great human being, you can be and should be interested in philosophy. You should have discussions with philosophers the way Frederick did with Voltaire, the way Frederick conquered Europe at his time, gained military successes that his father never ever dreamt of. He's a very interesting personality, and luckily this is a brilliant biography, perfectly written. I would really recommend you to read it, especially if you are interested in personalities such as Napoleon, whom, by the way, Frederick the Great inspired, or Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Scipio Africanus, and you name it. And the last book is written by Marguerite Yourcenar. It's called Memoirs of Hadrian. It's a book that is going to be on top of my favorite books of 2023 and perhaps of the last decade. I'm not exaggerating it. It is a wonderfully written story of Hadrian's biography and his life, and it's written in a fictional form. It's based on true person and true events, but it's a philosophical reflection that Hadrian has on the last months of his life. He talks about what he learned in his life. It resonates and comes very close to Horace, for example. I mean, in a sense, the way it is written, the way the ideas are expressed. I really enjoyed reading this book. It is one of my favorites, and I struggled to review it because this book is 280 pages long, but each page has around 10 different highlights. There is so much to say about this book. There are books that I want to come back to. There are books that I don't want to leave and put back in the shelf after I read them. And Yourcenar's book is one of them. There was one thing that I failed to mention to you in my first video about parallel reading, in which I give you a step-by-step guide on how you can practice this, on how you can read multiple books at a time. The thing that I failed to mention is that once you will start reading multiple books at a time, your focus will become much clearer. You'll be more focused. This sounds paradoxical, but the reason for this is that every parallel reader carefully selects the books that they are focusing on in a certain time period. And once you start doing this, you will see what topics and what subjects you're actually curious about. Because before I started practicing parallel reading, I thought that I'm interested in every topic that is out there, that there is no subject that goes beyond my curiosity. But once I started carefully selecting books, I started noticing connections such as between Marguerite Yourcenar's book and Horace's Epistles, because those two books are very distinct. Horace's Epistles is philosophy written in poetical style, while Yourcenar's book is a historical fiction. But those two books are written in the same style because Marguerite Yourcenar imitated Horace. She imitated in her style Seneca. She tried to be a modern philosopher speaking through the mouth, through the mind of Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian. I noticed this connection solely because I'm a parallel reader, and I selected those two distinct books that captured my attention separately. Another thing that I wanted to mention before we go is that I wanted to show you that a parallel reader never stops reading, because the moment I stopped being interested in Judith Schalansky's book, The Inventory of Losses, instead of taking a pause, instead of trying to finish it before proceeding to the next book, I just simply put it down and switched to the book that
I already had on my focus. And before we'll go, I would like to apologize for the sound quality of this video. I was visiting family and forgot my professional microphone at home, so I had to use the microphone that is in the camera.
This was my brief video where I just shared with you some books that I'm currently reading. I hope you enjoyed it. All of those books are going to be reviewed in my newsletter, which you can subscribe to if you'll click in the link on the link in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed this. Family is calling. I have to run. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.